Looking back after all this time, it makes me want to ask myself what the big deal was, and yet, it had such an effect on my sense of security for years. Actually, it still does. I would check the windows and doors at night after putting the kids down for bed, and then I would check them again. Their dad, not trusting anyone for security but himself, would ask me if I'd made sure everything was locked up tight. I'd say yes, and then he'd go back and check everything I had just checked. So you see, these roots go way back. We moved into the little 3-bedroom, 1-bath house on maybe an acre of property. My parents had purchased it as a rental in the high desert during the fall of 1977. We loved it. The population of the little nearby town was only about 1,500 at that time, and where we lived was a sparsely populated neighborhood, about 5 miles from the actual town, with houses scattered about and only a few within sight of our place. My husband, James, especially fell in love with the area's isolation and peace. The house was cozy, with a dining nook that had windows on 3 sides, one of which housed a swamp cooler that made it a perfect place to read on a warm day. It was a small room, but a bookcase, corner chair, and dinette set just fit. I think it was our favorite room in the house, and certainly a favorite place to study and work. My husband would settle in there at night, open the windows for a cross breeze, and study to the scent of creosote bush and sage, whistling through the screens on cool, dry desert winds. This was back before cell phones and voicemail, and I was working a swing shift at an answering service at the time. I had been given Wednesday and Thanksgiving Day off that year, so it was agreed that our family would meet at our house for an afternoon dinner. There would be 14 of us. I'd spent the day before cleaning, hiding clutter, setting out candles, dusting, trying to shoo away the St. Bernard puppy that after correctly sizing us up had decided treats would be more forthcoming from a house with kids. Other than that, generally fretting over what I was serving, and whether or not we could get a signal strong enough for us to watch the game. Everything was ready when company arrived, though, and the day was easygoing and pleasant. There were family stories and the usual lingering around the table, visiting while the kids dragged toys and games out of the playroom, or napped briefly, wrapped in blankets in the reading chair while the adults talked. By the time the sun slid behind the mountains to the west and the air began to chill, most of the dinner had been consumed, put away, or packed up for sharing. Everyone began to retrieve jackets, claim doggy bags, and walk out into the front yard. We're a family of long goodbyes, and we stood in the driveway chatting or finishing up a story that was interrupted by an exciting play during the game, until I'm sure we were all chilled to the bone. Many hugs and kisses later, the last car drove away, and I herded the kids back inside for their baths. The house seemed stuffy after visiting in the chilly air for so long, and my husband was getting his books and papers together to study at the table. So once the kids were in their pajamas and winding down in preparation for bed, I stepped outside onto the porch to breathe in that cool desert-scented air and postpone the decision of what to do with the turkey carcass, all but the roasting pan, which I chose to give a good long soak, had been dealt with in the traditional women's fellowship at the kitchen sink. Personally, I think I might have left it until morning, but when faced with 3 industrious, earnest women willing to help you do the right thing, and who are already scraping and stacking your greasy dishes, you fellowship. The air was perfectly still and almost cold. The sky was darkening quickly, but there was still enough light to see that the dog was back. He crossed the road slowly, more out of confidence that there was no need to hurry than caution. He climbed up onto the porch, yawned, stretched, and lay down at my feet, looking at me expectantly. I told him no, as sternly as I could, and then thinking of the turkey carcass said, well, maybe, but later. I checked to see if he'd acquired any dog tags since the last time I'd looked. Still had the collar, but no tags. His owners were pretty cagey, no doubt having figured out just how much a big dog can eat. Dog sighed, chin on paws, having resigned himself to being treatless for the moment, and closed his eyes. It was still and peaceful. Always pleasant to stand on that porch at the end of a day and listen to the wind or the sound of a distant train and stare off across the empty field on the other side of the road. That night, though, it was unusually still, or at least it had been. I gradually became aware of a buzzing sound. It definitely sounded electrical, and it seemed to intensify as I tried to identify its source. I went to the edge of the porch and squinted, looking at the transformer box up near the top of the telephone pole across the road. The little red indicator light was still glowing. I guess that meant something. I wondered if we were about to have another power outage. There had been quite a few lately. If the transformer went out, I had plenty of candles. It would be very appropriate for this time of the year to be bundled up, drinking tea and reading a book by candlelight. Not a bad way to end the day. But now the buzzing was really getting loud. I was almost sure I could feel it on my skin. I stepped to the edge of the porch again and peered at that red light on the telephone pole. The dog got to his feet, sniffing the air, fur bristling, his eyes fixed on the field. The next few minutes play in my memory in slow motion, but I know it happened very quickly. I had just looked down at the dog, wondering what was bothering him, hushing him, as he began to give a low, rumbling growl. I turned to look back across the road when the buzzing sound that had come from somewhere up around the wires dropped suddenly to the ground in an instant. In the pit of my chest, I felt as if a net had been dropped on me. And apparently that dog did too, because as I grabbed for the screen door and panicked to get inside the house, the dog nearly knocked me down. I slammed the door, locking the deadbolt and setting the chain, quickly drew the drapes closed, and then stood there trying to catch my breath, feeling very foolish. I couldn't think of what had come over me. I had gone from a sort of dreamy observation during a quiet moment to an all-out panic, with that icy fear gripping my heart instantaneously. There was no explanation for what happened. I hadn't been nervous or alarmed by anything before that moment. I decided to try and put the incident out of my thoughts, as if, and not mention it to James, who was just then coming down the hall with his books. I'd never hear the end of it if I told him what had just happened to me. He began to set up at the table to study, and I went in to get ready for bed and read myself to sleep, or so I hoped. I was dealing with my semi-annual case of bronchitis at that time, and the cold, dry night air sometimes brought on a terrible coughing spell. Over-the-counter cough syrups didn't help very much, but anything really effective would have made it too hard to shake off the drowsiness in the morning. I had way too much to do before work, so I just coughed. When James came to bed around midnight, I'd been having a pretty rough time of it, and after about 20 minutes, he took his pillow and blanket into the living room to sleep on the couch. My coughing spells always kept him awake, and I was aware of his leaving the room. But about 30 minutes later, I was startled to see him standing in the doorway. I could just barely make out his silhouette. He seemed to be looking into our room. I don't know why, but I didn't ask him what was going on. It had just been an unsettling evening, and his strange behavior puzzled me. Without turning on a light, he went into the kids' playroom, and a minute later came back out, again, standing in the hall and seeming to listen. He next went into the room the kids shared. I thought I heard the soft click of a window being latched. Now he was in the hall, hesitating. I could tell he was going back through the house. I watched the door until his shadow filled the doorway again. He seemed to be debating whether or not to go back out into the living room to sleep. My coughing had subsided, and after a minute or so I heard him come back into the room. Without saying a word, he climbed into bed, turned on his side to face the door, put his arm protectively across me, and was soon asleep. I would have asked him if anything was wrong, but I was trying to hold on to the drowsiness that would soon take me back to sleep, and I figured if it were bad news, it would still be there in the morning. I had to work my swing shift the next day, so I got as much done in the morning as I could, and before I left made a dinner of leftovers for James and the kids to have that evening. Work was slow and I'd brought a book to read between calls. I didn't think too much about my incident from the night before, until a couple of hours before I got off work. Our car wasn't very reliable, and it was a very dark and lonely 5 miles to our house from the little standalone building that housed the answering service. The more I thought about the car possibly breaking down and stranding me along the road, the more I dreaded the drive. I kept going over the events of the previous evening looking for logical explanations, with the hope of pushing back the fear that was threatening to grow into a full-blown panic. It was ridiculous. I knew James would be at the table studying, so I called the house at about 11:45 and told him that I was really tired, and if he could please open the door for me when I got home, so I wouldn't have to mess with the keys. I didn't know why, but he said sure. Well, that seemed way too easy. I was to pull up on the porch, honk the horn, and he'd open the door. I was relieved that I wouldn't have to take that extra 10 seconds to deal with locks. The car did make it home with no problem, thank goodness, and I pulled up so close to the porch that you might have to walk across the hood in order to leave the house. I honked the horn and scrambled up to the front door. James opened the door, grabbed my arm, yanked me inside, then quickly shut the door, locking the deadbolt and setting the chain. That was weird. He went back to the table as if there was nothing out of the ordinary, and I went to get into pajamas. I knew I'd never be able to go to sleep, so I checked on the kids, tested the windows and back door locks, got a magazine and went back out to the dining room to sit at the table with him while he studied. I sat down, opened my magazine, and asked how things had gone while I was at work. We chatted for a moment before he went back to the books. It was very still in the house, and I saw that the dining room windows, which were usually open a crack even in the coldest weather when James was studying, were now shut and locked, with the shades down. I glanced at the door. It was locked and chained, and the living room drapes were held shut with a clothespin. And then I noticed the rifle leaning against the reading chair. "What on earth is going on?" I asked. "You heard something, didn't you?" He hesitated a moment and then reluctantly replied, "Well, I wasn't gonna say anything because I knew you'd get upset about it, but remember last night when I came out to sleep on the couch?" I nodded, feeling sure I knew what was coming next. Anyway, I was about to fall asleep when I heard this buzzing noise outside. That went on for a while and I didn't think much of it, but it started getting louder. I was just about to go outside to see what it was when I happened to notice that the drapes that never really meet in the middle were gapped, and that bothered me for some reason. That dog that hangs around here, he must have been sleeping on the front porch because I could hear him growling by the front door, and then maybe because I was expecting it, I thought I heard someone walking on the gravel in the driveway. Suddenly I had to get to you and the kids. Make sure the windows and doors were locked. That's what I was doing. I locked everything, and then I had to go back and check everything again. It was like some premonition or something. I felt like I needed to watch the doors and windows. It was weird. I told him what happened to me earlier in the evening, and we discussed things logically and decided it was probably something very ordinary, and we were just tired. It had been a long day. We had too much fruitcake. The coffee was caffeinated. You know how it goes. Then he went back to his books, and I went back to my magazine. Case closed. About the time we were ready to turn in, though, there began a very low, rumbling, almost soundless vibration that began in the floor and moved up to the windows and right into our chests. I said nothing. James said nothing. The walls began to vibrate just enough to rattle the brass plates hanging above the bookcase. I looked up at them, and then the rumble became more audible. My husband, who had remained pretty cool and calm through the whole ordeal, turned to me and said, "Well, what the hell is it?" I opened my mouth to try and speak, but just then, we heard a train blow its whistle. It was one of those 5-engine freights that go through on the way up to the pass. The tracks were just below us, about a mile away. We were able to laugh about that. It had broken that icy tension that had been building up in the room, and we were able to relax enough to go to sleep that night, never having to admit that it didn't answer any of the questions. The questions never were answered, and our nightly ritual of locking the doors and windows, checking the locks, and then checking them again continues to this day. It's up to me now, and I should probably check that door just one more time.